What if I told you that the most iconic duo in electronic music actually started as a rock band with 3 members? And in theory, if the third bandmate had taken up an interest in electronic music like the other 2 did, then Daft Punk may have ended up as a trio. Now that's obviously not what happened, and this is because the third member wasn't going to abandon his dreams of being in a successful rock band. So he took his own path, while his former bandmates went on to achieve greatness as Daft Punk. You may be thinking that he just faded into irrelevance and became nothing more than an interesting piece of Daft Punk trivia, but that couldn't be any farther from the truth. In fact, his decision to forge his own path resulted in 2 world-famous Grammy-winning groups being born out of an otherwise unremarkable teenage garage band. At least their music was unremarkable, but the band itself played an irreplaceable role in the story of each group. But in order to fully understand the importance of this band, we need to go back in time to before it ever existed. As you probably know, Daft Punk is the duo of Thomas Bangalter and Guy Manuel de Homem, Christo. But before Daft Punk ever existed, they had met at school around age 12, and they bonded over their love for rock music and cinema.
And eventually, I think 5 years later, when we were 17, we said, oh yeah, let's try to do a rock band.
However, they needed a guitarist, so they set out to recruit a third member. They posted a flyer at a local record store, and a young man named Laurent Brancowitz reached out to them. After meeting him, Guy-Man and Thomas decided that he was the fit that they were looking for, and the 3 of them chose to name their band Darlin, inspired by the Beach Boys song of the same name. Darlin recorded a total of 4 songs in their short time together, and they also played a handful of live shows. They were somehow able to convince Stereolab's Duophonic label to release 2 of their tracks on a compilation vinyl called Shimmies and Super 8. However, this compilation wouldn't be released until roughly a year after the label agreed to put the Darlin tracks on it, which is actually a very important detail, and I'll explain why. In that window of time before its release, Thomas and Guy-Man went to their first rave in Paris, and they were completely blown away. The energy and music were unlike anything that they had experienced before, and consequently, it made the rock scene feel dull in comparison.
Looking at these people that were dancing, and this energy that was around this music without knowing what music was being played, and the energy was very different than in the rock concert at that time.
Another quote from Thomas appears in a book called The Song of the Machine, where he says, "At last we would discover on a decent sound system Chicago house and Detroit techno, the dance music which would change our lives." The discovery of this new type of music led Thomas to purchase a synthesizer and sampler so that he and Guy-Man could produce their own dance music. One lesser-known fact about Thomas is that he actually wasn't the first producer in his family. His father was a renowned disco producer under the name Daniel Vanguard. Now that Thomas and Guy-Man had become fully immersed in production, their band Darlin had naturally fallen to the wayside. The third band member, Laurent Brancowitz, didn't share this same interest in dance music, and he wanted to remain focused on rock. His younger brother had recently started his own garage band, so Laurent decided to join as the 4th member, though it would be a couple years until they established themselves as anything more than just a garage band. In April of 1993, the Shimmies and Super 8 compilation record that featured those 2 Darlin tracks was finally released, even though the band was essentially inactive by this point. But that didn't matter because this record is an extremely important part of the story. Had it never been released, Daft Punk would have ended up with a completely different name, and I'll explain why. 1 month after its release, a review of the compilation was published in Melody Maker magazine, written by music critic Dave Jennings. To give you a brief summary, he basically said that the whole record was garbage. His review of the 2 Darlin tracks reads as follows. The 2 Darlin tracks are a Daft Punky thrash called Cindy So Loud and a bizarre fuzz guitar reading of the Beach Boys' Darlin. Thomas and Guy-Man found this to be pretty funny, so they decided to run with it and name their new duo Daft Punk.
We basically turned this bad review into something good.
Now with an official name, they completed their first demo later that same year, a 7-minute techno track called The New Wave. It made its way to Soma Quality Recordings, who immediately offered to sign Daft Punk to the label. It was then released as the lead track of the New Wave EP, which was the first official Daft Punk release. One year later, they released their breakout track, Defunk, which made Daft Punk one of the most in-demand names on the DJ circuit, and this was years before they started wearing the robot helmets. Virgin Records was desperate to sign them to capitalize on the hype, and Thomas' father gave them some guidance to make sure that they didn't get screwed over. In fact, he actually gave this same guidance to their whole peer group, which included the famous French band Air, as well as Laurent's band, which we'll get back to shortly. The advice he gave clearly worked because eventually all three groups got deals with Virgin, but anyway, let's get back to Daft Punk. After getting signed, they dropped their debut album Homework, which obviously contained their breakout track Defunk, but it also contained a track called Phoenix. Now you may be wondering why I chose to mention Phoenix, because it's not anywhere close to being one of their most recognizable tracks. But the reason I mentioned it is because of a little something to do with their former Darlin bandmate Laurent Brancowitz. While Daft Punk was busy becoming a global sensation, Laurent's band was playing gigs around Paris where they would play covers of artists like Hank Williams and Prince. The band cycled through a bunch of different names during those first few years, but by 1996 they were getting ready to release original music and they needed to commit to a permanent name. They decided to name their band Phoenix as a nod to the Daft Punk song that appears on their Homework album. At least that's what some sources claim, but I personally haven't seen enough to be convinced that this is actually an undeniable fact. But it is very believable and highly plausible given the timing of when the song was released and when Phoenix chose their name, plus the direct connection that Laurent has to Daft Punk. Phoenix didn't have a meteoric rise like Daft Punk. Instead, they had to steadily build up a following over more than a decade before achieving their own global mainstream success. But despite the differing trajectories of the two groups, they still found ways to collaborate on multiple occasions. For example, Thomas Bangalter made an appearance on Phoenix's debut album where he plays synthesizers on the track called Embuscade. The most notable crossover between Daft Punk and Phoenix wouldn't take place for 10 more years after this song was released, and we should probably talk about what each group experienced over the course of that decade. Now, as we've already established, Daft Punk was well known entering the 2000s, and they had quite the journey over the following 10 years. In 2001, they stepped into their iconic branding when they debuted their $65,000 robot helmets alongside the release of their second album, Discovery.
The album is called Discovery, and that's for the audience to discover it.
This album is my personal favorite, and it was a huge success overall, and its cultural relevance was cemented with the release of the Interstellar 4-5 film in 2003. However, when they released their third album, Human After All, in 2005, it wasn't received as well as the first two. People eventually came around to appreciating it, but at the time of its release, it was kind of a low point for Daft Punk, at least relatively speaking, because to be fair, Robot Rock and Technologic still did pretty well commercially. At the Cannes Film Festival in 2006, Daft Punk revealed their self-directed 94-minute art film called Electroma, which they actually used to announce their breakup 15 years later in 2021. Their iconic Coachella performance also took place in 2006, and this was followed by the Alive 2007 tour and subsequent album, which actually gave fans a new appreciation for Human After All. Most people would probably consider this to be the most noteworthy era of Daft Punk, and this led to Disney asking them to score Tron Legacy. Obviously they agreed, and they also said that it was the most difficult project they had ever done. In 2009, they finally won their first 2 Grammys after coming up short in both 2002 and 2006. This was obviously a very high point for Daft Punk, but to make things even better, Laurent's band Phoenix was absolutely exploding in popularity at this very same time. In fact, it's probably safe to say that Phoenix was even more popular than Daft Punk at this specific moment. So now with Phoenix and Daft Punk both in the global spotlight, the three former Darlin bandmates had a very unique opportunity where they would reunite together on stage one last time. Except this time, it would be far bigger than anything their teenage minds could have ever comprehended. But before we get into the details of that, let's focus solely on Phoenix for just a moment. For essentially all of the 2000s, Phoenix was able to steadily grow a European fan base with consistent touring and music releases. However, in 2009, that steady growth became a thing of the past when they were catapulted into the stratosphere after dropping their fourth album, Wolfgang Amadeus Phoenix. If you happen to click on this video, then you're probably old enough to remember this point in time, but if you weren't, then I seriously cannot overstate just how inescapable these songs were.
The all-new 2010 SRX, the Cadillac.
In 2010, Wolfgang Amadeus Phoenix won a Grammy for Best Alternative Album, and Phoenix sold out Madison Square Garden later that year. Laurent decided to top off this career-defining moment by inviting his childhood friends and former bandmates to come and join him on stage for the first time in nearly 20 years for a surprise encore. It's pretty wild that the notoriety of each group just happened to line up in a way that made such a grand reunion possible, and I'm sure that this was a mind-bending experience for all three of them. It also just seems nearly impossible that a rather unremarkable teenage garage band could break up and eventually have 100% of its members become Grammy-winning world-renowned artists in two separate groups. But that's exactly what makes Darlin so special, because without Daft Punk or Phoenix, Darlin would just be a long-forgotten Daft Punky thrash.